I will talk about why feminists should fight for animals, but also the reverse, why we should have more feminism in the animal rights movement. This is something I've been doing in Poland. I've been connecting the two, like my friend here said. And I will show you some of the ways that I've done this in Poland. So I will begin with an introduction, and then I will present the talk that I usually give to Polish feminists about this connection, just as a kind of inspiration that you can use in your countries if you want to speak to feminists there. And then I will show you some further ways of involving feminists, what I have done in Poland, and some of the lessons I have learned. And I will end with a take-home message. So you already know a lot about me, so I don't think I need to go through this. The only thing I'd like to add is that apart from fighting for animals within the feminist movement, so in the Women's Congress, I also lead the Vegan Lady Boss group in Poland, which is the reverse, so bringing more feminism into the animal rights movement. The reason I'm giving this talk is that I strongly believe that animals need all the allies they can use. These allies aren't always obvious, but bringing more people into the movement is absolutely crucial. We can't just stand in our own circle, we need more people. We need diverse people within it, and I think one of the strategies, a successful strategy, can be involving people from other movements. So people who already have the talent, expertise, connections, everything that we need in activism, they can help us and bring this in to our movement. And my presentation will show how I have used some of these tactics to involve feminists, specifically in Poland, in the struggle for animals. And by showing some of the arguments that I have used to convince prominent feminists and regular feminists to join the fight for animals. Like I said, I'd like to inspire you to do the same in your countries if you have the option there to speak to feminists or to other movements which are similar as well. So why should feminists fight for animal rights? This is what I tell feminists. I ask them, first of all, why is it in the best interest of women to have better animal protection laws and for society to respect animals in general? I ask what are the common motives in women's struggles and the plight of animals in society and how our positions are similar. And I also talk to them about what connects our two movements. And this, I believe, is that we are guided by the same values. We share a common burden with animals as women. We have the same enemy, which I believe is patriarchy. We have the same goal, which is ultimately freedom from suffering, and as dignity is respect. So solidarity between our movements is necessary for both of us to win our causes. We're deeply connected, we depend on one another. Some of the interconnections that I've noticed, I've grouped them into 4 areas to make it easier to present to you. Of course, these can be grouped in many other ways, so this is just a simplification. So I will talk about objectification as the first interconnection. I will also speak about violence. Third, language, which is a kind of bridge between the two for me. And finally, inconvenience. So beginning with objectification, it's always those who are stronger who take away the objectivity of those who are weaker. And the very fact that they are weaker is a kind of excuse to use them. So in general, in society, men objectify women. This is what we call patriarchy, and people objectify animals. And I will show some of the analogies here. So it's mainly bodies which are objectified. And women, for instance, are portrayed as sexual objects in the public sphere. In society, and this is especially visible in advertisements and commercials, where you can see female bodies advertising absolutely anything you can imagine, from beer to cars to suits. I will show you some examples very soon. And in these commercials, oftentimes female body parts are shown up close, kind of as if these women consisted only of these body parts and weren't human. And also women are objectified in other ways. They are first of all a body, only later a human being, like I said. So we're judged by our looks, we're judged by whether we're mothers or not, by our age, if it's still attractive for men, and historically also how useful we were as childbearers, as cleaners, as cooks, so on. And all of you have seen, I'm sure, women as props, hostesses, and the sexualized images of women in music videos. So some examples I'd like to show you, and that I show to feminists who usually know these examples already, but it's a good way of showing analogies. The commercial on the left is a Polish one, and it actually translates into, she knows what will be in her mouth in a second. So it's a commercial of an energy drink. The good news is that this was put off television and they had to pay a fine for this commercial. This was the only case that I know of where this actually happened in this context where women are objectified. However, it was up for a long time, and many other commercials are still on television and newspapers and other places without any consequences. Some other examples. These you may know, they're international commercials, so they're in many countries. And here, the one on the left says, "Can she make you lose control?" It's a deodorant advertisement. And on the right, I find this one, I think, most shocking because it's actually a social ad. So you'd think that people who prepare social ads are more sensitive to issues like this. This is an ad to become a donor, an organ donor. And it says, "Becoming a donor is probably your only chance of getting inside her." Here, some other examples. You may wonder what this has to do with a car, for instance, or a suit. A vodka commercial, and a meat shop. So sometimes selling the parts of animals is connected to the female body parts. Some other parallels I'd like to mention, and that I speak to feminists about. When they see these commercials, it's obvious to them, they're bewildered by them, of course. It's something they know about. They often, however, don't see that animals are portrayed in a similar way. So analogically, they're treated like things by humans in society, and they can be consumed, they can be worn, they can be used for painful experiments, entertainment, so on, so on. And ironically, they also appear in advertisements and commercials, usually as happy chickens, happy cows, happy pigs who just dream of being eaten or giving up their own eggs and milk for humans. So in essence, both women and animals live in systems of violence where our bodies, their bodies, serve somebody else, somebody who's stronger than them. And I always tell feminists that if we allow any group or any species at all to be objectified, no matter who it is, we actually agree to the process itself of objectification. So this inevitably will lead to others being affected by it as well. Even if one day we actually achieve full equality for women in society, but we leave objectification towards animals, we allow it, I think it will come back to women or to other groups, minority groups, for instance. Some examples now of animals and the analogies of how their body parts, also like women, are just that, body parts, not sentient beings. And here on the left, a very old commercial you may know, where a pig is actually butchering herself to be eaten by us, by humans. And two other examples, the one on the right above says, "We'd like you to milk us for all we're worth." And the one below is about a happy cow offering her own milk to humans. So in general, the process of objectification is denying somebody's ability to think, to feel, to need. You all know this. So women are often viewed as being closer to animals or more like animals than to men, than to humans, because men are more human. And we are often denied rationality. We're said to be guided by hormones, by emotions. We are biologized in a sense and kind of full of instinct. So like the maternal instinct is one example of this. And this leads to us being thought of as worse leaders, unable to take on important roles, not having mathematical IT talents, or even being bad drivers. Unless, of course, we man up or we grow a pair, then we'll be fine. So analogically, society denies that animals have social needs, intelligence, empathy. We usually say they can feel pain, and that's the most that we can allow. In general, in society, we don't say they are sentient beings. This is only known in our small crowds. And the treatment of both women and animals kind of shows what kind of a hierarchical society we live in. I see this hierarchy as men at the top, followed by women, children, and animals at the very bottom, along with the planet, with the environment in general, you could say. And then some examples of advertisements which actually manage to offend both animals and women at the same time. So on the left, you have girl power. On the right at the top, this is actually a Polish slaughterhouse, chicken slaughterhouse. So I'm not sure what the author meant here. Perhaps that we'll buy more chicken meat by seeing this image. And the one at the bottom says, the translation reads, protects nutritional values from the sun. So it both offends women and animals, you could say. And a recent example on the next slide, these pictures were taken a month ago in Poland in a small but very touristic town. These are kind of local souvenirs that you can buy. So they're like in the local market, they're hung up on this fence where you can just buy these images. And these are sexualized images of women next to images of violence towards animals. And next to them, it's not on the picture, lots of Catholic images as well. So we all wish it was a little bit more like this, the parts that we neglect to mention, that animals are conscious, sentient beings, and it's her body, not ours. I will move on to language now, the second interconnection. And like I said, this one is a kind of bridge for me between objectification I just spoke about and violence that I will speak about afterwards. So usually the first step to justifying violence is to objectify someone. To take away their dignity and rights. And this is done by language oftentimes. So we use language to objectify someone. And it then becomes okay to hurt them, because how can you hurt a thing? You can't hurt someone, you can hurt someone who's less than, you can't hurt a thing. And oppressive language towards both women and animals is, I believe, an inevitable part of our patriarchal society. Where, like I said, women are portrayed as sexual objects and animals are things that we can use. So in essence, we're both products, perhaps animals even more so than women. And our language has a way of belittling harm that's done to both women and animals. You will know many of these sayings, and I'm quite sure you'll have them in your own languages. I've looked at a few languages. It appears in all the ones that I know. But here are some English ones. So when a woman is harassed, she can often hear, where's your sense of humor? You know, boys will be boys, and don't be so dramatic. It's only a compliment. It's just what men do. And sometimes even when a woman is a victim of rape, she could hear that she was asking for it, or be asked what was she wearing that night. Analogically, towards animals, humane killing. What does this actually mean? How can any killing be humane? Why is it so typical in our language to use this phrase as if it were normal? And what about species regulation used by hunters? Or the very fact that we call dead bodies of animals meat or fur, that we count them in kilos and tons instead of individuals that they were, not that long ago. And another element of language I'd like to show you is offensive animal names. I've also seen this in at least 4 languages. I'd love to know from you later on in your languages if it's the same. But there are many offensive animal names, like a cow, a bitch, a hen, a pig, donkey, many others that are used mainly towards women, not only, but mainly, as offensive names. Same as animal qualities and activities, which can be offensive as well, like barking, yapping, being bitchy. Also used more often towards women than men. And of course, any vulgar words and expressions that you can imagine are often come from animals. So, like I said, they're used mainly towards women. And the big question is, why are these animal qualities, animal names, offensive in the first place? Kind of like feminine ones are. Feminine qualities, which are more offensive than male qualities in society. And what I'm trying to say here and point out to feminists when I speak to them is that contempt towards women and animals goes hand in hand, basically. There is a phrase in Polish, an offensive phrase towards women, which is a house hen, and it means a woman who stays at home, takes care of children, and doesn't mean anything in society. And this big feminist group in Poland, the Women's Strike, has actually used this offensive Polish expression to our advantage. So they made this graphic design, and it says, "Become a women's strike hen, come and lay a petition." And they invited thousands of women to join a big protest for reproductive rights and to sign a petition that way. And the third interconnection I'd like to talk about is violence, which is made possible because of objectification in language. So research has shown by now very strongly that domestic violence, but not only domestic violence, is strongly connected to violence towards animals. And there's lots of research dating back from the 70s which proves this. I won't have time to go into the details of each piece of research, but I'll just name some of them, the most important ones to you. I can send the slides later on so you can look them up if you like. So animal abusers are 5 times more likely to commit violent crimes against people, mainly women. This has been proven by the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in 1997. The American Psychiatric Association uses animal cruelty as one of its diagnostic criteria of conduct disorder. Dr. Frank Isiona, back in 1995, proved that 71% of battered women that he researched in shelters have said that their abuser had either harmed or threatened to harm their domestic animal companion. FBI profilers, interestingly, also use animal abuse as one of the most important indicators of violent behavior towards humans, especially women, in the future. Slaughterhouse employment, in comparison to other industries, increases the total number of arrest rates in a given area. And these are arrests mainly for very violent crimes, often sexual crimes as well. And finally, 70% of people who have committed violent crimes against animals have also committed other violent crimes towards humans. This is also the Massachusetts Society. So some of the important similarities here are that it's extremely difficult, at least in Poland, but I think in other countries as well, for victims of violence to find help, to get justice, both women and animals. Women are often ashamed, or they think nobody will believe them, at least in Poland, so they don't take issues like harassment or rape to court. And animals obviously cannot even file a lawsuit. So in Poland, whenever animal abuse is taken to court, it's done by women. I've spoken to lawyers who have these cases, and they said that 99% of the cases are brought by women. I don't think this is a coincidence either, that we're the ones who stand up for animals in such cases. So in Poland, when it actually does happen, when cases of violence towards women or animals are brought to the attention of the judicial system, courts usually dismiss them. They either say that they don't have enough evidence for a given crime, or that it's a petty crime, not important enough to proceed further. I'm also really interested to know if it's like that in your countries, if you'd like to talk afterwards. And interestingly also, as part of their violence toward their partners, men have been proven to often threat to hurt domestic animals that the women love. And many shelters for women do not accept animals. They accept women and children, for instance, but animals usually not. So many women, large numbers of women, stay home with their offender, with their abuser, to protect their companion animals. And what I try to say here, when I show these similarities to feminists in Poland, is that violence is absolutely universal. It's caused by the perpetrator's sense of power over the weaker victims. So the mechanisms are the same, always, no matter who the victim is. And in order to end violence towards women, we have to end all violence because it's interconnected. This part is perhaps slightly more controversial, but if you take a closer look at factory farming, you'll find that violence is gendered here as well. We say that violence has a gender when it comes to humans. I think if you look closely, female animals are also treated differently because of their sex. And this is not to say that the suffering of male animals is any less important than that of female. But what I do point to is that the tortures that females go through are different. And they include, for instance, forced insemination, which also adds to the general normalization of the rape culture, you could say. And when I speak to more radical feminists, I even use the word rape when speaking of animals. It really depends on who I talk to, but in order to convince them, I either use this word or just forced insemination. Some other tortures, as you know, include continuous pregnancy, taking away babies without the consideration for the mother's pain. The example of cows shows this clearly. So female animals are therefore objectified on an even greater scale, in a way, because they're not just consumed like male animals, but they're also used as incubators and producers and live a life of torture in disastrous conditions and end up on people's plates in the end anyways. So some examples: cows in milking, laying hens in cages, pigs in crates. And finally, the last interconnection that I show feminists is inconvenience. So like for most men, it is inconvenient to acknowledge the full equality of women. And this also goes for men who call themselves feminists. If you look closer, oftentimes, especially in private life, in home life, it's really difficult to have full equality. And if men were to acknowledge the full equality of women in society, this would just mean fewer privileges and more obligations. More chores, for instance, equal pay, parity in parliaments, inevitable and high penalties for violence, no tolerance for harassment. And analogically, would it not be the same with animals? If all of us in society, and the feminists that I speak to, accepted that animals are not just capable of feeling pain, but so much more, that they're full beings, sentient beings who have their complicated needs, would they not need to change all their ways, from what they eat, to what they wear, to what they do for entertainment? And what I try to point to here as well is that it's not just inconvenient for the animal products industry or the animal products lobby, but for all of society, because just as the full equality of men and women is for men, for people it would be a lot of differences, a lot of changes to acknowledge this. So to summarize this part, I say that the aim of both our movements, the feminist movement and the animal rights movement, is to minimize suffering. It's to provide dignity for those who deserve it, who have been deprived of it. And it's not just our position as women and as animals in society, and not just the guiding values that connect us, but everything that women and animals endure is interconnected. So it's objectification, language, violence, inconvenience, and many other things as well that I haven't mentioned here. And we depend on one another. So when speaking to feminists, I always urge them to join or at least support the animal rights movement, in the name of not just solidarity, but also for our own good as women. And here, speaking to an animal rights crowd, I also encourage you to take a closer look at the feminist movement, because we do need a lot of feminism in our animal rights movement as well. I'll show you some examples of that too. So apart from giving this talk to feminists in Poland, there are other things that I do to connect the two movements. And here are just some of them. I will only go into detail with one of them, which is the Animal Center at the Women's Congress, because it's probably the biggest project that we're doing at the moment. So the Animal Center at the Women's Congress is something new. It happened last year. The Women's Congress is the largest social movement in Poland at the moment. It has many, many events each year. It has lots of activities that it does, but it has one main annual event which has up to 5,000 attendees. It consists of debates, lectures, and workshops, which are grouped into centers, usually 15 to 20 centers. And so far, these have been centered around women's rights, so they've been focused on things like equal pay, politics, women in politics, health, her story, so on, so on. There was even a green center, which sometimes touched upon animal rights, but only domestic animals, and only slightly as a kind of side note. So since last year, we've set up an animal center, which is focused largely on farmed animals. And in 2018, like I said, it was the first animal center. We have a logo here. It consisted of 4 debates. The first one was what I just spoke to you about, so why should feminists join the animal rights movement? We also talked about hunters and showed women who stand in the way of hunters in the Polish woods. We showed women who fight fur farms and other farms in their local, very small towns. And we gave feminists a kind of step-by-step guide to make better consumer decisions. So basically veganism, but for those who weren't ready for it, some other steps they could take. And during the first 2 minutes of the first debate, there were only like 5 people in the audience, so we were kind of terrified that nobody would come, that actually feminists just aren't ready for this topic, or that it's not interesting enough to them, compared to the other centers, for instance. But if you look at these pictures, that changed about 2 minutes into the debate, the first one. And we were extremely heartened to see that it really exceeded expectations, that the crowds were so huge they couldn't fit into the room. There was like a large queue, and people had to sit on the ground everywhere, somewhere outside of the room listening in. So it was one of the largest audiences of all the centers last year, which kind of shows that feminists are really ready for this topic, that it's worth using, this readiness for the advantage of animals. And that's why I'm presenting this here for you to maybe try it out in your countries. And because of this, because it exceeded expectations, this year we're having the Animal Center again. And this is the exciting thing that's going on in Poland. That is my update to the talk. This year, we're one of the main 3 themes of the Women's Congress. So it has 3 themes each year. The main themes is usually something like politics, equal pay, so on. This year, the first main theme is environmental protection, including animal rights. So our center will have one of the biggest rooms, and also the Women's Congress has adopted a progressive animal rights program. It's very progressive. I wrote it myself. And they agreed to take it in fully without any changes, which was very surprising. And also we've managed to convince the Women's Congress to have 100% vegan catering for the whole event. So even more so, there is a new director of the Women's Congress, very open also to animal rights. And there's going to be a ban on leather sale and animal-tested cosmetics also, because there's also a sphere within the Women's Congress where you can buy products. There are companies there who have their stands. So it's usually lots of leather, lots of wool, lots of cosmetics which are tested on animals. This year, no. And also I've been elected to the Women's Congress main council, where I constantly advocate for animal rights within the Women's Congress. So it's easier to do it from within than from outside. And now I'd like to show you how it should work the other way too. Apart from putting more feminists into the animal rights movement, I'm trying to also put more feminism into the animal rights movement, so the other way around as well. In Poland, it's not as bad as it is globally, so we have a lot of women leaders in animal rights organizations. However, still, in many countries, women are the majority of activists, while men are at the top. And in Poland, we're still lacking kind of sisterhood within the movement. We're lacking a kind of solidarity between women within the movement. So I'm trying to build this. I organized the first Vegan Lady Boss Club in Poland. Do any of you know the Vegan Lady Boss? It's in many countries. It wasn't available in Poland until this year, and lots of women came. This is the picture from the first meeting. It was very diverse. There were not just activists, but also businesswomen, like people who had their own vegan restaurants. There were journalists, politicians. Even our first MP for the European Parliament, who's vegan, also came to this meeting. So we exchanged lots of great ideas, best practices, and helped each other out with many projects. The second meeting was also really nice. And in general, the Vegan Lady Boss's mission is to support and to empower vegan women to change the world together by working together. And all of you can set up a group like that in your country. So it's an international club. You can just contact the main organizers and set it up for yourself. It's really inspiring. I really encourage you to do this. And actually, these women were kind of the ones who caught these ideas right away, even more so than feminists in the Women's Congress. So when I told them about language, for instance, we had a whole meeting, 3-hour meeting devoted to language, to how language is oppressive towards both women and animals. And for some reason, animal rights activists, vegan women, get this right away. And they brought so many ideas, so much inspiration to talk about this as well. Some lessons that I've learned when doing this is that I wouldn't ask for everything at once. My example is before the Animal Center of last year, I wanted to have an Animal Center before that, the year before. And I asked the leader of the Women's Congress, who was not too eager, to say the least. She thought it was extremely exotic, that nobody would come, nobody would listen to this. She said it's not an animal rights conference. It's a bit too much to have a whole center for it. So we managed to negotiate and have this debate devoted to ecofeminism on the main stage, where I just got 5 minutes to speak about these issues. And she said, okay, let's do an experiment and just see if anybody listens to it at all, if anybody is interested, if they like these ideas, or if perhaps they think they're too exotic, too radical. And they did like it, so that's why we have the Animal Center now, which is why I encourage you to ask bravely. Even though, don't ask for everything at once, but ask bravely. It may seem exotic at first for some group or in a given circumstance, but you can change that slowly, and you'd be surprised at the good reactions of some people. For instance, the Women's Congress is known for being a bit liberal, a bit elite for heterosexual white women, which are at the very top of it. This has been changing largely in the last 2 years. So these women were hard to convince, but once we've brought these topics in, some more other topics have appeared, like LGBTQIA issues are at the Women's Congress right now. Some more social issues, poverty is finally a topic there too. So it's more inclusive, and the Women's Congress is changing, it's evolving. very much. And one thing that's worked for me, perhaps it will work for you too, is to find a prominent person within a given movement who cares already about animal issues, for instance, and can open doors for you. So for me, this was the leader of the Women's Congress. Even though she wasn't eager to have an animal center at first, she did care about animals very much. This was only domestic animals at first, but we had a few lunches together, some coffees, some phone calls. And finally, I managed to open her eyes to farmed animals, which isn't that hard when somebody really cares about animals in general. You just need to spend some time with the person. And now she's always saying yes to whatever I come up with, so in the Women's Congress. It was hard at first, but it's really worth it to find a person like that. So my kind of take-home message for you is that if you're a fellow feminist and animal lover, use these arguments to persuade your feminist circle to join the animal rights movement, or to at least support it, and vice versa. And this goes not only for the feminist movement, I think. There are many, many other movements, like the LGBTQIA movement, anti-racist movement, and many others, where we have many of the same values, many of the same goals, where much of the oppression is based on patriarchy as well. And if you're involved in other movements, human rights movements, for instance, connect them, use these same values, these same goals to enlarge our ally base for animals, because animals need all the help they can get. And also, interestingly, research has shown that activists in one field are much more likely to become activists in another. Not to mention that they bring all the experience they have already and all the connections, which can be important for both movements in the end. So, find similarities and common goals, and let's get more support together to finally end factory farming, to end all cruelty against animals and patriarchy. And I'd like to end with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite authors. To talk about veganism is to threaten the pillars of patriarchy. Carol Adams said this in The Sexual Politics of Meat, which I really recommend to you. So thank you.